The Center for Educational Media and the College of Education at Middle Tennessee State University are proud to offer professional development to K-12 educators in Tennessee through our online video library. These videos are aligned with standards set by the Tennessee Department of Education. For more professional development videos, check out our website at www.mtsu.edu/CEM.
My name is Lydia Simpson, and I am the Programs Manager for the Center for Historic Preservation at MTSU and a former park ranger at Stones River National Battlefield. Where we are today is right on the edge of the battlefield. Took place here December 31st, 1862 to January 2nd, 1863. Significantly, in the middle of that battle on January the 1st, the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect that was intended to free any slaves in states that were in rebellion. Now, that didn't exactly apply to Tennessee because the federal government was in control of Tennessee at that point, starting from the Battle of Fort Donelson, and then the federal government came and occupied the seat of government in Nashville until the end of the war. So after this battle was over and the Confederates retreated, the Union came in and occupied Murfreesboro for the remainder of the war. During that time, they constructed Fortress Rosecrans, which was a massive supply depot that would help move supplies down the line from Nashville to Chattanooga and deeper into the South, which played an important strategic role in the ultimate Union victory in the American Civil War. At the end of the Civil War in 1865, there was a tremendous amount of work left to be done to reinter the bodies of the fallen from all over Middle Tennessee. The 111th United States Colored Infantry was charged with that task, and they were stationed here at Stones River to build Stones River National Cemetery. That was some grueling work that took place over the course of a year or so. They were going up the railroad line about 80 miles to bring the bodies of the fallen soldiers to be interred at the Stones River National Cemetery. While they were doing that, they rejoined with their families. Long-lost family members found each other, and they formed a community that became known as Cemetery. The heart of that community had churches and schools. At one time, there was a school called the Tennessee Manual University that had been founded by men who were actually free prior to the Civil War. They had been free black men living in Nashville prior to the war, and they founded a school that was an attempt at the same model that Tuskegee became. It was a manual labor school devoted to teaching people what were considered useful skills in society. They owned property just south of where the National Cemetery is now, just about a mile from where we're standing. Ultimately, that school was disbanded after several attacks from the Ku Klux Klan and financial problems. They had difficulty continually getting the support needed to keep a university open at this location. But for many decades, the cemetery community flourished right here at the Stones River National Battlefield. Some of the highest rates of property ownerships among the freedmen in Rutherford County were here in what's considered the 9th District of Rutherford County, where in the county before the war, close to 50% of the whole population were enslaved people. And by 1870, the number of African Americans in the district had grown exponentially. About 50% of the total population of Rutherford County was black. In this district, African Americans outnumbered white residents about 3 to 1. So you can see this was a really important community during the Reconstruction era for African Americans trying to find their way in the new context of freedom, of having possession of the fruits of their labor. That was a very complicated process, and community building was important in being able to really lay as much claim to that as possible. Families would join together. You might have 2 or 3 soldiers, veterans of the United States Colored Troops, who with their pensions could band together and buy large plots of land. The land here in this district is not very good land. A lot of people were ready to let go of it for 2 reasons. For one thing, the soil is very rocky. There's a lot of limestone. We are on a karst area, so the limestone is very, very close to the soil, a very limited topsoil layer, very hard to farm. And also for a lot of the local white residents, because the Battle of Stones River was ultimately a Union victory, it was a place of hard memories for them. And so the land was available cheaply, and you have a high percentage of property ownership, allowing African Americans to enjoy a level of independence here that was brand new in the new context of freedom. Over the decades, more schools and churches formed, including Stones River Methodist, Ebenezer Church, and Mount Olive Church. Cemetery School was founded and had several different buildings for it over the years. And then the property owners' families stayed here for many decades until in 1927, the United States federal government finally decided that it was time to form a commemorative battlefield here at the Battle of Stones River. Cemetery community by the 20th century was an example of the type of community African Americans formed during the Reconstruction and Jim Crow period all over the South. One of the things that's unique about the cemetery community is that its fate was decided in the end by the creation of Stones River National Battlefield. But the community was larger than what ended up being cleared for the battlefield and included neighborhoods that are still standing today. However, the wake of the Great Migration also diminished the population of the area, as well as workers in the early 20th century were moving out to northern and urban areas to find wage work.
So by the late 1920s, when the federal government decided to move to Murfreesboro and acquire the former battlefield of Stones River and convert it into a national park, that was the point that the citizens of cemetery community were forced to move. Through eminent domain and court order, the federal government swooped in and forced the residents off their properties, and that included all the businesses and churches as well. So those places had to pick up and move. One of the churches literally was picked up and rolled on logs up the street, according to folklore. And the other church, they simply dismantled and rebuilt it up the road. So where we're at today is the new cemetery community, or the re-envisioned cemetery communities. African Americans were forced off their land down the street and had to literally just pack up and move up the road and acquire new properties. By the 1940s, the school building behind us was constructed. It is the cemetery school building as we know it today. And during times of segregation, this was one of the hearts of the African American community. With 3 historic black churches right adjacent to us and the school behind us, this becomes the new heart and soul of cemetery community. And it's what the space that African Americans re-envisioned as they're once again forced off the land and forced to rebuild community here in Murfreesboro. So one of the questions that has to be answered is, why is this place still important today? Why is cemetery community such a viable part of today's infrastructure of Murfreesboro, but also more importantly, the history and legacy of our African American community here? And that is simply to state that these structures that still remain today, this school building, these 2 churches, they are the remnants of this African American community that through so much adversity, so much trauma, these African Americans were able to stay true to what community means, to their foundations, their school buildings, their churches, to use those structures as places of refuge and safety. And today, to tell those legacy stories through all this adversity, just like our national history, African Americans stayed to the land, stayed to each other, and made it through and prospered to the best of their ability. We hope that these structures and this community can continue to tell that story to our children of how African Americans came out of hundreds of years of enslavement to build their own viable communities, to tell their own stories. What's happening recently in Murfreesboro is a lot of development. We're seeing that throughout the nation. And here in Murfreesboro, right up and down Old Nashville Highway, we have a lot of older residents selling out, a lot of older residents passing away, and their children no longer live here. And so land is being bought up and sold. And with this development, there's only a few key places that still tell this story. Like I keep saying, the schools and the churches, there's several residents up and down the highway out here that still continue to tell that story of what it meant to live in cemetery community, what it meant for the citizens of cemetery community, what safety and sanctuary they had in this cove of Murfreesboro, if you'll call it that, where they were able to build their own viable community to try to get away from outside adversity. And so we hope in the future that all of this will be incorporated to possibly a National Register nomination where the government can give back in a way to the citizens that were moved off their land almost 100 years ago, and maybe they can find some help and assistance to keep these structures preserved and to continue that legacy story for future generations. And now we're at Benevolent Cemetery, just south of the historic Murfreesboro Square. The cemetery is very important because it speaks to the legacy of African American community building in Murfreesboro and Rutherford County after the Civil War and even after Reconstruction. What's important here is the fact of we're in a space that African Americans could claim for themselves in a time, Reconstruction and the period after, where African Americans were being even more segregated, even more isolated in community and in the larger society. So the cemetery was founded in 1897 by Benevolent Society of Murfreesboro, and it was actually technically called the Benevolent Lodge Number 11. African American benevolent societies were created after the Civil War. The one for the state of Tennessee was founded in Nashville in 1865, incorporated by the state in 1866, and by 1868 they were founding charter societies throughout the state. We're not sure exactly when the one here in Murfreesboro was conceptualized, but by 1897 they were trying to carve a space for the burial of African Americans. The idea of the benevolent societies was to take care of the community, to take care of African Americans, especially the elderly, in their time of need, and most importantly, to make sure they had a respectable burial upon their death. And so cemeteries, although there were two larger city cemeteries, once again, African Americans were segregated in life and death. At the city cemeteries, there were small African American segregated sections, but it wasn't enough for the residents here of Murfreesboro. The census statistics of African Americans being close to 50% of the population after the Civil War. Surely it's declining after the Civil War, but there's still too much space. They need a space of their own to claim as their own for their burials, for the respect of the dead, and that's what they founded here outside the historic city limits of Murfreesboro at Benevolent Cemetery. The Benevolent Society was able to purchase 8 acres of land here at the cemetery. There was active burials here from the turn of the century well through the 1900s. The last burial in this cemetery was around 2002. So what you see is layers, if you will, through the decades that speak to the history and heritage of African American community of Murfreesboro and Rutherford County. There's a lot of folks buried here. To date, we've recorded over 1,500 interned, and those can include all walks of life. It represents the different levels of society here in Murfreesboro in terms of African American history and heritage, from the common worker to the preachers and teachers to the community leaders. There's a lot of veterans buried here from many wars, from the Civil War to the Spanish-American War, the World Wars, even Korea and Vietnam. So this site is very, very important, not only to the entire history of Rutherford County and Murfreesboro, but obviously to speak to that African American history and heritage. It tells legacy stories that are not recorded elsewhere, and that's why preserving these places is so important today. We're actively working on trying to get the cemetery nominated on the National Register of Historic Places so that it can be brought to a wider audience, so people are more aware of why these cemeteries are important places of cultural awareness and American history.